and welcome to this month's webinar with the Cruising Division. Once again, we've transported ourselves to webinars, and I think so far we've been pretty successful. We have a really interesting guest tonight who's returning to the Cruising Division, John Vaughan. But I'd just like to say welcome to everybody. We have 80 registered people for tonight, which is just overwhelming for us as a committee. And on behalf of David Henry, the chair of the Cruising Division, I'd like to welcome you here. John, who spoke to us a couple of years ago, is no stranger to the squadron and has advised the squadron on numerous matters throughout the time. He's been the CEO of the Australian Heritage Society. He's done many talks in relation to etiquette and protocols to do with flags. You'll see from the way he speaks, he's very passionate about this particular subject, and it's a pleasure to actually have him here. He has been involved with the design and the making of flags, Australian regional flags, heritage flags, and so on. He's a life member of the Sydney Heritage Fleet, and he's also a foundation member of the National Maritime Museum. So, John, welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here, and I'm enthusiastic as ever to talk about flags. I'm going to start with a little bit of poetry. It's only a piece of bunting, only a coloured rag, but freedom has made it majestic, and time has ennobled our flag. That, of course, is the Australian national flag, and on the 3rd of September, we celebrate 120 years of our flag of freedom flying over Australia and throughout the world. It was adopted after a unique public competition, 32,823 entries and 5 winners, because they came up with near identical designs. And it was raised for the very first time at the Royal Exhibition Buildings in Melbourne, which was the original first Parliament House of Australia. So very important time coming up on the 3rd of September. And for our nautical friends, that's all of you, it's the birthday too of the Australian Red Ensign, because both flags were designed together. The blue was the official flag and the red was always our merchant flag. So it's Merchant Navy Day and Australian National Flag Day, both proclaimed days by the Governor-General. Now, what I have is a range of things to show you about the history of flags, about what sort of designs are around and whatever. But we're specifically talking about what we see on the waterways, how to get your flags looking their best, how to dress ship. And there's a little document that I've left with you that will be printed off for anyone who wants the etiquette and protocol of flags, but we might mention a few things. Dressing ship is the 40 code flags from stem to stern. Now, there's a special order that they should go in so you don't send any nasty messages. You're not in distress or keep clear or dangerous or whatever else. So you stick to the international method of hoisting those flags in a set order.
John, may I interrupt for just a second? This is just to help the management of the talk. I wanted to just say to our audience that there's a question or a chat facility down the bottom of the screen, and this provides an opportunity to just ask questions whilst you're speaking, John, and then if appropriate, we might be able to answer those questions during the presentation, and if not, we'll leave it to the end and cover them then. So those listening, please feel free to use the chat function, put your questions forward, and then Richard and myself will put them to John at the appropriate time. Sorry to interrupt, John, carry on.
They'd have to be tailor-made questions to you.
Indeed, nothing but.
Now, when you're dressing ship, for instance, you can be complimentary about others, or you can be insulting. And this does happen, particularly with the ensign staff at the stern of your boat, your yacht. That is the #1 position on the vessel. And that is the most important. That's for your, what we call the national colours. That is your red ensign, which represents Australia when flown alone. It has the power of the national flag for that purpose. And then the next and most important position is the masthead. But of course, these days at the masthead, we've usually got other fittings and fixtures, and it's very difficult to fly a flag from that position. So we go then to the starboard spreader, which is number 3 position, and then the port spreader, number 4. Now, there's a very simple way of flying flags, and if you don't have a halyard rigged to your starboard or port spreader or both, you simply take a short piece of cord like this. I'll show you one that I've rigged up here. There is a piece of cord that we're going to join together when it's round your stay. Let's say we're doing the starboard spreader. We tie that round the stay with a little block attached. And there's your halyard, as you can see. And what you do, you stand towards the bow and you throw the halyard over the spreader and slowly pull this loop up till it laps over the top of the spreader, and you have an instant halyard, which you can tie off to the turnbuckle. So for cruising division and the like, it's a perfect place to put your signal flags to indicate that you're in the division or one of the divisions for cruising yachts. It's also a perfect place for your burgee. So you might be using the port side for other signals. So once again, you do the same procedure on the port side. Now that means too, if you don't want the halyards to stay there after you've done your cruising, you just reverse the procedure. You stand down the stern and you throw the end of the halyard, weighted, over the top of the spreader, and your loop will slide down the stay. I hope that's simple. Anyway, it's also in the document I've left with you to for members to get a copy and to try it out, see how you go. Now, another thing about wearing your ensign, that's what it's called, rather than flying, you wear your ensign. If there's a VIP, Richard and John might be the VIPs for the opening of the season, and one's the Commodore, whatever, you can join the parade, line astern, and you can dip your ensign in salute. Now, most ensigns are on a fairly short ensign staff. So as a consequence, you don't have a halyard you can adjust and lower the flag to approximately half mast in dipping and then raise it again. So you take the ensign staff out of the bracket and you turn it parallel to the hull or to the deck, and you place it over the stern. You should get a response then from the VIP officer or the VIP vessel. Then you raise the ensign back up and put it back into its bracket. So that's a salute. There's also half masting of a flag. So with the recent death of the Duke of Edinburgh, I half masted my red ensign for a week, and that's a sign of mourning. If you can't half mast, you can actually tie a little black ribbon just under the truck at the end, the top end of your ensign staff. Now, there are many other things I could mention about dressing ship and whatever else, the right order and that, which we've done. I think I'll leave that for that document I've left behind.
John, if I can just come in there, one of our committee members at the squadron has come in to say that the order of flags is actually published on the squadron website in our bylaws.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And as the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron, that is most appropriate because you've got to set the pace for every other sailing club and yacht club and show what's done and how it's done correctly. So that's first class. Now, on your spreaders, you might have, apart from the beautiful squadron burgee, you could also have your own personal house flag. And the word burgee goes back to Anglo-Norman days. In fact, it goes back even further to Latin days. And burgee was a borough or an important place, a castle, a fort. And the royalty who owned it put up a flag to say it's in my ownership of this royal family or this wealthy merchant. And as a consequence, when merchant ships were very important, trading around the world, they would create a house flag. The owner would create a house flag and raise it at the highest point on the ship, on the top of the main mast, to indicate that was the P&O line, or it might be Duncan Dunbar or something like this, and put the flag at the top. Millers here in Australia had a very nice house flag as well. So house flag's very important, and you can translate that into your own personal flag. Now, a personal flag might have a design. For instance, you know, you might like to have the initials of your family. Well, you may not put them in letters, but you might take code flags. So if you've got a surname starting with R, you would have the R flag in the code. And that one is Romeo. And then your next initial would be S or whatever it might be. And you taper that flag down into a broad pennant. And that makes a distinctive house flag for you, because not too many people would have several code flags in an order that was the same as someone else. So that's a little idea. You can also put a design on a flag if you want to. You could have your own yacht in profile. And there's a lot of fun. There's also the gin pennant, the red wine pennant. There's also a church pennant for religious occasions, and I'll show you those a little later on. Perhaps now we might look at the history of flags in Australia. Now, it really starts with modern settlement. And here's a flag you may all know. It's the red ensign, but it's not the modern red ensign. There is a cross missing on this flag. In this red ensign, there is no St. Patrick's cross, because that didn't come till 1801, when Ireland was represented on the flag by the cross of St. Patrick. So here we have the cross of St. Andrew and the cross of St. George. That is St. George for South Britain, England, and the cross of St. Andrew, the saltire, for North Britain or Scotland. And that was the best known flag in the whole wide world, because most of the trading going on at this time when this flag was current was from Great Britain and the British Empire as such. The next flag I'm going to show you is the flag that was used to claim Australia. It's called the First Union flag. Once again, there's only the two crosses. And on the 26th of January 1788, that was raised in Sydney Cove, near what is now the Customs House. And if you're very observant, you'll find a flagpole there, and this flag still flies on that spot. And of course, in those days, it was right on the waterfront, but we've filled in Circular Quay, as we call it today. Now, the first locally designed flag in Australia was 1806. I don't know if you've seen this one, but it's quite unique. It's not a good design of flag because it's rather complicated, but it was a celebratory flag to celebrate the victory at the Battle of Trafalgar that saved us and New Zealand from Napoleon. And it was a very important signal. And down the bottom in a scroll, it says, "England expects every man will do his duty." And that was, of course, the famous signal that Nelson raised on HMS Victory. And the original Victory is still in Portsmouth. So when we can travel again, go and have a quick look. There's the emu and kangaroo with a rose, thistle, and a shamrock. Rose for England, thistle for, of course, Scotland, shamrock for Ireland. The Welsh got missed out there, but maybe there's a leak hidden in the bushes there under the kangaroo and the emu. So that original flag is in the Mitchell Library. Well worth having a look. Was raised by John and Honor Bowman at their farm Archerfield at Richmond, New South Wales, made of Mrs. Bowman's silk wedding dress. That's how patriotic she was. Now, this one was the first Southern Cross flag. It's called the Australian National Colonial Flag, dates from 1823-24, and it's the very first time the Southern Cross appeared on a flag. Appropriately, it's the white ensign used by Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Took a year to sail out the good news of the victory. And this one is it's a very gracious looking flag. It didn't last too long. It was replaced in 1830 by this one with an extra star, which not only represented the 5 stars of the Southern Cross, but the 5 principal modern settlements of Australia. This was called the New South Wales Ensign, the Australian Ensign, because let's face it, Australia was only becoming a popular term around that time. Macquarie had invented in Flinders, and this one had a life of 70 years. So a very popular flag. You'll note too that Eureka was inspired by this particular design, and I'll show you the Eureka flag later. There was also a merchant or shipping flag as well with 2 extra blue bars. That's the 1830s. There was a Port of Sydney flag, which is now the house flag of the Sydney Heritage Fleet. And being a life member, I'm entitled to fly the Burgee. Now, by 1851, there was a strong movement to stop transportation of convicts coming to Australia. And guess what? The Reverend John West, he wasn't a canner, by the way, he was a reverend. He came up with this brilliant design of a golden Southern Cross and a blue field, very similar to the national flag today, except there's no Commonwealth Star. It was called the Australasian Anti-Transportation League Ensign. Rather complicated name, but a nice looking flag. So there's a forerunner of the national flag as we use it today. There's also flags of places, the Murray River, 1853 and onwards. This still flies on the Murray River paddle steamers. And once again, the 5 stars of the Southern Cross. The Eureka flag of 1854, it was well known on that one occasion and then was forgotten until after the Second World War. The design was actually lost. One participant in the battle at Eureka, the rebels described it as a red flag. Another one said it was a blue flag with a simple white cross. And the reason that it was said to have just a white cross was that the stars you see here didn't have a blue fimbriation or border. So as a consequence, at a distance when the flag is flapping, it just looked like a white cross. Anyway, I've got a very small piece of the original Eureka flag, and I can guarantee this is the right colour. But it was much bigger, 12 feet by 8 feet. It was quite a large flag and is now kept in Ballarat. Now, by the 1880s and 90s, the New South Wales Ensign or Australian Ensign had taken on a new name. It was called the Australian Federation flag. And notice the lighter blue. And it was widely used for coats of arms and everything else. The basis of the arms was this central cross with the 5 stars. And that flag was used by Sir Henry Parkes to motivate the separate sovereign British colonies in Australia to unite. United we stand, divided we fall. Now, most importantly, federation's coming up. And of course, there was a general feeling of great patriotism that we should get together and that we must get together. Together we would be stronger. So the Herald in Melbourne, the Evening Herald, ran a competition. And this competition was for a flag for the Federation of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia. And Mr. Mr. Francis Thompson, I should say, of Melbourne came up with this design. Here we see the Southern Cross as we see it in the sky. And notice the points on the stars vary and the size of the stars vary. He was showing the brightness of the stars to represent the size of the Southern Cross when you view it in the sky. These stripes below represented the 6 colonies that became the Commonwealth of Australia. Anyway, that generated a much bigger flag competition. And this one became the official Commonwealth of Australia, the government competition. And it was sponsored mainly by the Review of Reviews for Australasia, which was a magazine that was a little bit like the Reader's Digest. And there is the winning design. 5 people came up with the identical design. And that is the flag we celebrate today. Here it is. Notice the large stars. And once again, the bottom star, Alpha, has 9 points. You go around 8, 7, 6, and 5. once again showing the brightness of the stars in the sky. Now this symbol here is the Federation or Commonwealth Star. Has nothing to do with the Southern Cross or the pointer stars of the Southern Cross. It is a symbol of federation. So the judges looked at history, heraldry, distinctiveness, utility, that's whether you can fly it on the land, the sea or whatever, and cost of manufacture. And this is what they came up with, the principal flag that soon after the 3rd of September became our naval ensign. HMAS Parramatta I and HMAS Yarra I actually wore this as their national colours at the stern, not at the bow, as we do on the modern Royal Australian Navy ships. So when the Royal Australian Navy was formed, they put a white ensign at the stern, and this one went to the bow on the jackstaff. And the old days in the Royal Navy, the jackstaff was where the Union Jack went, and that's how the name Union Jack came about. Here is the red ensign, our national colours afloat, and it's the same design, but of course, a different background colour. Now, traditionally in the Royal Navy, there had been 3 separate flags, a red, a blue, and a white ensign. And there were 3 squadrons within the Royal Navy, and it wasn't until 1864 that the white ensign became the naval flag of the Royal Navy, and the red ensign solely the merchant services flag and private pleasure craft flag. So we carried on that great tradition with our red ensign. Now there was some confusion because people thought in 1901 on the 3rd of September, well, if the blue is the official flag, it's the government flag, because that's how things were done in those days. But of course they were wrong, and many errors were made, and the red ensign was often flown ashore and shouldn't have been. And that was clarified later in the piece. In fact, in 1953-54, the Flags Act was mooted, and the Flags Act was signed personally by Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, in early 1954. And that then confirmed the blue Australian flag was to be known forevermore as the Australian national flag. We also have a white ensign. Some of you may have had naval backgrounds. Well, this flag was introduced in 1967, March 1967, and replaced the British white ensign that had been worn by Royal Australian Navy ships since 1911. And this is the same as the Australian national flag and the red ensign. It's just the field colour is white, a traditional colour to define or to distinguish the Navy. Now, there are special flags too. There's the Queen's personal flag for Australia, and you see this, the Australian state badges. There's New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria. That one, of course, is Queensland and Tasmania. And last but not least is Western Australia. The Queen's Royal Cipher is in the centre, behind which is the Commonwealth Star of 7 points. Now, the 7-pointed star represents our 6 states, and all our federal territories are represented by the extra point. But they're only the federal territories, and we have many of them. The Governor-General has his own personal flag, and you can see that it says Commonwealth of Australia, and that's the royal crest at the top, as he represents the Queen of Australia, Elizabeth II. And the Governor of New South Wales, she has her own, Mrs. Beasley. There is the badge of New South Wales, which looks familiar, the 4 stars of the Southern Cross, which came about in 1876 as the New South Wales ensign, or New South Wales state flag as it's known today, surmounted by the St Edward's crown, the royal crown of Elizabeth II. There's also the Greater Sydney ensign, which has the crest of the city of Sydney in the centre, the ship Endeavour representing all forms of shipping and boating that have entered Sydney or been associated with Sydney. And this crest is the crest of our city, as I've mentioned. Now, there are a lot of fun flags too. This is one of my favourites. When that goes up, drinks are on. That's the gin pennant. And of course, when you put that up, you are putting on the drinks. So you get a friend to put the flag up on his boat or her boat, and you claim the drinks. So how's that? And there's also one I've invented here, the red wine pennant, for those who like a good drop of red. Now, here's a special flag that has extra value because I mentioned earlier the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Well, I was going to mention it. I'm going to mention it now. If you look very closely, there's a signature on this Greater Sydney Ensign, and this one has been hanging in my office for many years. This was 2008 when Dan Brandenstein, the commander of the US Space Shuttle Endeavour, signed this flag and signed a number of others that I donated to help raise funds for building the Endeavour replica. So that's quite a precious flag to me because Dan Brandenstein was so happy to come out. And you notice the way they spelt Endeavour on that flag? It's the way that it was spelt for the original ship. So instead of leaving out the U at the end of it, like Americans do, they put the U back into it. There is the flag that outranks the Australian national flag, the white ensign as well. Now, when a church service is on board a ship, this goes to the premier position. It is a combination of the old Dutch colours, red, white and blue, with the cross of St. George for England. And those two flags combined together, usually for funerals and other services on board a ship, that means that this takes precedence overall. The Americans have a similar church pennant, except it's blue with a white cross, and that flag outranks the stars and stripes. And when they hoist the flags together, their flag is hoisted over the top of the stars and stripes at the ensign staff of a US naval ship. Here's another one that is close to my heart. This is a special flag for the Anglican Church in New South Wales. And this was a maritime flag because it was flown by a relative of mine, also called John Vaughan, the Reverend John Vaughan, on the Hawkesbury River when he had a floating parish. And he had a launch, and he and his wife and children would dash up and down the Hawkesbury River flying this flag to tend to his flock of parishioners. Here's another one. If you're sailing to Lord Howe Island, this is the battle flag of Lord Howe, symbolised with the two crosses, St. George and St. Andrew, as rays of the sun. And there's the symbol of the island with a kentia palm, and the physical features of the island are celebrated in the middle of the flag on a sun disk. Well, that's just some flags. Have you got any questions, Richard? I can see you're thinking out loud.
There's actually one question that's come up, John, about the ratio of flags. The person asking the question is saying about 2 to 1, but those ratios change. Would you like to make a comment on that?
Yes, indeed. For instance, the Swiss flag is square when it's flown on the land, but when it's flown on a lake, it's 3 to 2 ratio. So they call that a maritime ratio. Our ratio is 2 to 1, or some say 1 to 2, whichever way you like it, but it's twice as long as it is wide. Mm-hmm. So is our red ensign, white ensign, and our state flags as well. So the idea was that in 1801, when the Union flag, the first Union flag, went from 2 crosses to 3 in Navy use at the bow of a Royal Navy ship, the Union flag was always flown in a 2 to 1 ratio on the jack staff, hence the Union Jack and the Jack staff. So we took that pattern, and it's very effective because it makes the flag look quite attractive. Here's one, for instance, I'll show you that I bet you don't know what it is. It's the Queensland separation flag. It's a bit reminding of lockdowns or whatever. They gave this flag a 21-gun salute, I think it was 1851, and it was never seen again, but it was in celebration of them leaving New South Wales, because originally New South Wales was all the eastern seaboard of Australia. In fact, it was half the continental landmass of this country. So that's the Queensland separation flag, based on the Royal Navy's white ensign, but with a pale blue, a sky blue field. In heraldry, by the way, you can actually show a design in straight lines or parallel lines. They can be vertical or whatever. And they represent colours. They're called tinctures. So in heraldry, if an emblem, like a coat of arms, is properly drawn in black and white, they have all these little lines and dots for gold and all those sorts of things. So it's well worth knowing, your flags. Here's another little thing I'll mention. There is an excellent book that's available free from your federal member of parliament. So go and see Trent. He's a delightful man, Trent Zimmerman, and he'll give you one of these. It's called Australian Flags, and it's all about etiquette, protocol, how to get flags right. And if you're flying the Australian flag in a group of flags, you get the right position. So very important. It's free and it's yours for the asking. Now, I have another flag here, and I'm sure you'll recognize it. That's the Commodore of the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron. Now, that's a typical birdshee based on naval flags. This is broad pennant. You can see it's broad, it's wide, and it's swallow-tailed. So you have two little tails coming out, and that indicates the Commodore is on board his vessel or on a courtesy vessel. You would put this up if he or she was on board your vessel or on his or her own. There's the Royal Crown. There is the Cross of St. George rendered in white. And there's your two little swallowtails as such. Now, I have one more to show you there that will really test you out. That's the first official USA flag. And it was also the East India Company flag, which was the largest trading company in the world at the time. And it was a red ensign defaced with white stripes. And of course, George Washington thought this was a good way of showing the differences between the mother country and the new United States of America. So this flag flew for 1 year before the Union Jack, as they still call the star section here, was replaced with 13 stars, making two crosses, St. George and St. Andrew's crosses in stars. Then as more states joined the Union, that pattern was lost, and today they have 50 stars in the Union Jack on the American flag, but they still have 13 stripes. Now, at one stage, they thought, well, we'll increase the stripes as we get more states joining the Union. But what happened was the flag looked pink at a distance. So they went back to the original 13, and there you have the cross of St. George and St. Andrew only, because this was pre-1801. 1776 to 1777, John Paul Jones, the famous admiral, flew this on his vessel in the War of Independence.
John, there's a question. Is there a registry of flags? And if so, who manages it?
Is there a what? A register?
A registry on flags?
Yes, yes. Look, the Admiralty, that's the British Admiralty in the UK, were the old register of flags. In fact, excuse me leaning over here, but I have a typical book of the Admiralty Book of Flags. This is a big edition, and I've got quite a few editions of that. The flags were registered and put into great books like that. That's the Indian Navy, which used the same pattern of flag officers' flags as we do. And there you can see all different flags. And that was the way we registered ours. So when the Australian flag was adopted in 1901, it was flown for the very first time on that day, a huge flag, 11 metres long by 5.5 metres, on the 3rd of September, was taken from the exhibition in the Royal Exhibition buildings, taken to the main dome of the buildings and raised to the top in a stiff southwesterly breeze. And the situation was described, it was a magnificent feature of the day. The new nation had its new flag flying perfectly on the day. But anyway, to dot the I's and cross the T's, the flag was to be confirmed as the national flag, or as the federal flag, as they used to call it, or the Commonwealth National Blue Ensign. And it, of course, was had to be proclaimed. So it went to the College of Arms in London and the Admiralty in particular to make sure that no one else had the same flag. And then it was drawn up properly and it was shown to the King, and the King approved it as fantastic. And in fact, pressure had come from Britain to make sure that we adopted a flag to distinguish our vessels, particularly the Navy, because we'd taken the various colonial Australian colonies ships, joined them together in the Commonwealth Naval Service, and they had to have their own flag because it was a new entity. And so that's the first use of our national flag in 1901. By February of 1902, it was already in South Africa. And in fact, the Australian flag was draped over the grave of Breaker Morant. And we have a photograph of that actually happening in February 02. So very quickly, the flag went to the rest of the world. And now, of course, it's seen in every country of the world when there's an Australian representative at sport or in the defence or whatever else. All our soldiers wear the shoulder badges, and it's most important. Now, if anyone wants further information, apart from the booklet that I showed you, there is a Flag Day Australia webpage. It's flagdayaustralia.com.au. There's also a Facebook page which I run. And I put all this interesting information with illustrations in the Facebook page. So you're welcome to come and join and see the true history of the Australian national flag. We also have messages from the VIPs, Governor General, Prime Minister, and it goes down the list of premiers and whatever else. Even the Lord Mayor of Sydney has given us her Flag Day message. So, and we work in with Merchant Navy, so they get a mention with the Red Ensign as well. So lots of things are happening, and it's very important. Now, I have something that's quite revolutionary I'm going to show you. First of all, there's the 5 winners of our flag competition in 1901. Now, this one up here has been unknown for a long time. That is his image as a boy. He was only 14. His name is Ivor Evans. And there is young Ivor. We've only recently found this image of him when he was a teenager. So previously, his dad got shown in the records, and it was rather unfair to him. In fact, I'll show you here very quickly. There's his dad up the top, and he was put down as Ivor Evans. So Ivor lost the credit of being the designer, or one of the 5 designers of the Australian flag. You notice the others here. There's a lady, Annie Dorrington from Perth, William Stevens from New Zealand, and of course New Zealand have gone its own way these days. And here the only designer in New South Wales was Les Hawkins, and we've got Bert Nuttall from Victoria. These 2 people here were teenagers too at the time, and as well as Ivor being only 14 years of age. So we have a very special, a rather unique, a radical design of our flag, because in those days, individuals, private citizens, weren't given any rights to design a national flag. We set the pace in Australia for that. So that's a little bit there. You've got another question, Richard.
Yes, John, could you comment about the use of the blue ensign and the red ensign? A friend of mine had his boat in the Med for a number of seasons, and he chose to fly the blue ensign while he was in the Med because all the other red ensigns that were being flown in the Med were very confusing for the people that walked along the docks and wanted to talk to people. And he found by flying his blue ensign, he became quite unique and attracted quite a different group of people.
Good. Yes, that is the tradition. That is correct, because the red ensign is used in home waters and on waterways like rivers and whatever else, Middle Harbour, for instance. Whereas when you go overseas into foreign waters, it's a custom to use the Australian national flag, because it's the most distinctive of the two, as you have just pointed out. That is correct. And in the screed that I've given you to run off for members, I mentioned that fact as well. We also mentioned dipping, half-masting, and the correct order for the signal code flags as well.
The other thing I'd like
how to rig a halyard without climbing the mast.
So, John, the other thing I'd like you to talk about is the defaced and underfaced ensigns. The squadron wears a blue ensign that's underfaced. Underfaced.
Right.
When I was a young boy, I was born into the Royal Motor Yacht Club. My family were motorboat people, and the Royal Motor Yacht Club and its branches were the leading motor club of the day, and they had a defaced blue ensign with I just can't remember what it is now, in I think the bottom right-hand corner.
Yes,
Can you comment on that sort of thing?
It's a gold cross with a royal crown in the centre, in the lower portion of the fly, the flapping edge of the flag. Okay, this is a very special privilege that the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron was given. It's called a warrant. And this warrant in the old days was issued by the Admiralty, and only clubs and squadrons of great status got to get a blue ensign. And in your case, an underface, that is without anything in the fly, was right up the top of the list, because this technically was an old naval flag prior to 1864, and subsequently after 1864 was used by special privilege retired naval officers of a very high rank. So, for instance, if you were a captain or something and you went commercial and you skippered the Titanic or whatever else, but you had been a naval officer of a high rank, you had the right to wear the blue ensign at the stern of the ship. And this was a great honour indeed. Now, you've got this locked in history, because in 1981, we passed in the Commonwealth Parliament, the Australian Parliament, the Shipping Registration Act. And initially they tried to phase out the Australian red ensign. And of course, there was a massive outcry, because the Australian Merchant Navy, which is usually only active during wartime or in crisis time, who carry the supplies in commercial ships across the world to break the blockades and risk their lives every inch of the way, every nautical mile of the way, they, of course, wore the Australian red ensign as an Australian ship. And so there was such an outcry that one gentleman from the Merchant Navy, who was quite elderly, actually collapsed and died after giving a speech on preserving the red ensign. So the red ensign was reinstated under the Shipping Registration Act, with the provision that the blue Australian national flag could be flown by Australian registered ships and private pleasure craft if the owner thought fit. But the tradition is the red ensign, and I'm a great supporter of the red, because the red ensign at sea is very visible. And so it makes up for all the Shipping Registration Act moves and whatever else by being re-established as the correct traditional flag for Australian private pleasure craft and Australian registered ships.
So
John, could I just maybe use this break to mention our new squadron racing flag? Have you got a sample of it there?
No, look, we've got some pictures to show you. And
okay, I also have one here, but it's probably better off if you use the pictures that you've prepared, because I think there's actually quite a few questions being put to us, and but I think one of them will certainly be of interest to all, and that's the introduction of our new...
This is the extra special moment when we get to those pictures, and we'll make the big announcement. But in the meantime, if Zach would like to show the pictures that you have ready prepared.
Would you like to begin
Drum roll.
Pennant, or would you like to start elsewhere?
Okay, fire away, start away. That's your special crest on the belt, which is wonderful. Oh, we've started with the most important thing first. There it is. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron, there is the new racing pennant, and it is very distinctive, very distinguished, and of course, you cannot mistake it for anyone else's but the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron. And it flies beautifully. It took me about an hour to take that photo, but it looks good. And I think it's something to be extremely proud of. And it's going to distinguish your yachts when they're racing, because that will go from the backstay using Velcro, and there's also tie loops on each flag, so you can do both. Or in this case, I've tucked the tie loops behind the Velcro so you can't see them. But it's a very special flag and a very important one for the future.
Thanks, John. The intentions is to have all squadron participants in squadron races fly the flag, so that we can identify that they are squadron boats racing out on the racecourse, particularly on the harbour, where there's often confusion as to which boats are racing in which from which club. So it's probably not going to end up being a protestable offence not to fly one, but the intention is to distribute these to the race entrance when we actually get out on the racecourse again, hopefully soon. So thanks for that.
Well, look, I've also mentioned it in the printout, and that it's only to be flown when you're officially racing, not to send any confusion in signals, so that it's reserved for Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron vessels that are actually in races and competing. Right, let's show those other pictures if we may. Drum roll. Here we go. There's the beautiful red ensign, and now that's how you should rig up your ensign staff. The angle of the ensign staff's up to you, but I have a vintage Halverson Garland 31 yacht of 1976, and I have these incredible stainless steel davits, so it's the perfect spot for it. Your flag should be taut right up to the truck. The truck is that end piece, the round piece, the cap at the top, and I've got it in perfect order. You never have a faded or torn flag. Next shot. Here's the dipping of the ensign. It's just been taken from the bracket at the stern of this beautiful vessel, and the gentleman there is about to hold that ensign staff parallel to the deck over the stern as a sign of salute and recognition of a VIP. Next one. There is 3 examples of dress ship. The first one over here is an old top hat, which I used to own, and that's dressed enthusiastically. That was at the bicentennial period, and I went out to sea to see the visiting warships in their parade line astern, and at that point the engine broke down. But anyway, we couldn't set sail because I had too many flags up, but I did get the engine going. The next one in the center of this diagram is the correct way of displaying your international set of 40 code flags. The red ensign's at the stern on the ensign staff, the #1 position. There's a red ensign at the masthead there because I had a free position to fly a flag up there. And I hoisted what's called a burgee staff, which takes you over the masthead and allows your flag to fly free. Now we have the burgee, the red and white burgee on the starboard spreader, and there's a Greater Sydney ensign from the port spreader. But of course there you would have the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron on the starboard side, and you could have your house flag or a Greater Sydney there, whichever you preferred. Now the compass photograph there, reprisal, is the correct code flags in the correct order with a few additional flags as well. And that one I had to get the vessel sitting at anchor in a wind that was not going the same way as the current, so the flags would fly. But we did it. Next one. There's the review of reviews for Australasian. If you note there, the magazine's actually signed by E.J. Nuttall, Bert Nuttall of Surrey Hills, Victoria. So this was his copy I found in the Mitchell Library. And this was primary evidence that the flag was always blue officially. And there's the winners with the wrong man as Ivor Evans. It's his dad, Evan Evans, who was a washed up Welshman, literally washed ashore in a wreck, the young Australia, and he went into making sails and flags. And there's Bert Nuttall, William Stevens, who was a ship's officer in New Zealand, and Annie Dorrington, who was an artist in Perth. And in fact, she now has a grave which is on the visitors list at Karrakatta Cemetery. It's on the heritage list to visit in Perth. And there's Ivor Evans getting his full honours. Next one. Now there is, of course, a wonderful collection of the official flags, including the burgee of the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron. Was one that we made up, or I made up when I used to be a flag maker. And there you see the various flags of rank, which are all marked on that display. Next one. And you have the most magnificent flag mast. It is a fully rigged mast. It's the mast of the sailing ship Bellambi, 110 feet to the truck, donated by J. Whaley, I think it was in 1903. You probably have the best flag mast in the whole of Australia. It is precious. It is rigged like a sailing ship because it came from one. Now, the number one position, I've got a demonstration flag mast here. I'm going to sit back a bit so you can see. Your mast is like this. It's got the yard, it's got the gaff, and this is the peak of the gaff where my finger is, the number one position. Number two position is the masthead, right up here, if you can see it. Number three is the starboard spreader, or in this case, the starboard yard. This is the whole yard arm. There's the yard, and there's the port over here side, and that is the number 4 position. So that mast is the mast that used to be on Snapper Island. It was a wireless mast once here in Northbridge near Castle Crag, and they transmitted music, and of course Len Forsyth, the Sea Cadet commander, flew his flags there as well. Next one. Now, this is a very important flag chart. It comes from the New South Wales Calendar and Post Office Gazette of 1832. It was written and produced by John Nicholson, who was a former captain in the Royal Navy. And you can see there on the right-hand lower side, we have some of the flags of the colony of Australia, and it includes what we now call the Australian Federation flag, then called the New South Wales Ensign, and the popular flag for 70 years. There's also the Sandwich Islands, which is Hawaii. They still have the Union Jack in their flag as an American state. And there's also New Zealand and the pilot flag, which is white over red, right in the bottom section on the lower right, white over red, which means that the pilot's vessel is going out to put the pilot on board a ship, and they then use the H flag in the code when the pilot's on board the ship bringing it into port. So that's a very important chart, and over on its right here you have a project that I was involved with for 30 years of lobbying and that was to reinstate one of the two giant signal masts at Observatory Hill, which was once Flagstaff Hill. It's now Sydney Observatory. The place was called Fort Phillip, and this was the signals that were copied from South Head, where they had the lookout signal mast, South Head signal station, and they could tell by using the flags on this chart, special local flags, what ship was approaching the port, whether it was a vessel from a set destination coming to Australia, whether it was carrying mail, it was carrying female convicts, male convicts, you name it, it could be signalled using those flags in the centre of that New South Wales calendar chart by John Nicholson. So very basic but simple communication by signal flags. On this mast you see various signals there that indicate phases of the moon and the stars, and there's some historical Australian flags, including the Bowman flag of 1824, 23-24, and the National Colonial flag too. There's also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, which are private flags, but they are registered under the Flags Act, but there's a private copyright on the Aboriginal flag by the elder who owns that flag and designed it in 1971. His name is Harold Thomas. Bernard Namuk designed the Torres Strait Islander flag, which is green, black and blue. And of course, the Aboriginal flag is black over red, the black race over the red heart or countryside of Australia, with the sun uniting the two.
John, could I just raise a question at this point about the Aboriginal flag? What is the protocol? We've been asked by John Hancock's one of our cruising members to explain the appropriate time where you might fly the Aboriginal flag.
NAIDOC weeks, there's 2 of them each year. That would be important to put up both, because the Indigenous races are, of course, the Torres Strait and the Aboriginal people, or peoples in this case. So as a consequence, yes, you could put them up on the flag mast from the yard, or put them up on one of your separate flag poles near the slipway there. That would be the ideal place, and perhaps keep your big flag mast free for your club blue ensign, and at the masthead your burgee, which is all of 6 feet long, or 1800 millimeters in the metric system. Next slide. Now, this is the most important thing. This is the great landmark of Port Jackson, Sydney Harbour. This is the signal mast at Cannae Point at the back of North Head. And once again, I led a campaign for very many years to have the mast, as you see it there, bare of any paint, because the lowermost section, the bottom half of that flagpole, had been there since the 1830s and is still there. It now needs repainting again. But in my hands here, I actually have a piece of the original mast. And this is very precious to me. It's made of a South American pine, but it's preserved by the salt airs coming through the heads. And that's why it's lasted so long. In the center of this slide, you have a picture of the mast as it was, with the paint peeling off. But if you look very closely there, you can see initials of people that had to go there in quarantine in the quarantine station. And there it is painted, the other photograph, and it's majestic on the rocks on the end of the point at the back of North Head. So next time, have a look at it. It's very precious. The problem at the moment is National Parks and Wildlife say it's the responsibility of the Q Hotel, the quarantine hotel, to maintain it. And the quarantine hotel say it's National Parks and Wildlife that should maintain it. So I'd hate to see it deteriorate again, because it is extremely rare. It's possibly the oldest, longest standing in situ mast in the world. Next slide. Most important thing again. Here we go with the racing pennant. congratulations to everyone in the squadron. I think it's a fine flag. It's purpose designed to indicate your vessel is competitively racing in an official race. So well done indeed. Any further questions you've got there,
Yes,
Richard or John?
I do have one. Yes, the question is that apparently the squadron has a register of yachts that are entitled to fly the Blue Ensign. Would you understand what the criteria there is?
Right. Okay. Now, when the Shipping Registration Act came in 1981, the warrants couldn't be further granted by the Admiralty. In fact, the Admiralty is only a fraction of its important status that it once had. So the warrants that were issued to that date were locked in. So the administration of the squadron would probably have a list of those who still have those warrants. And you, as an administration, would have the authority to allow the plain Blue Ensign to be worn depending on the criteria or criterion that you set as a squadron. So it's over to you. This also applies to other clubs too that have warrants to wear special ensigns. So it's in limbo.
Then can I ask about the Sydney Amateur Sailing Club? They actually have an ensign that all their boats tend to fly from the main flagstaff.
Yes, in fact, it's a white ensign of the old style, but instead of the central red cross of St. George, it's a dark blue cross on a white field with the Union Jack in the top canton or corner. And this goes back to when the Royal Prince Alfred wasn't royal. They were the Prince Alfred Yacht Club, and they were based in Sydney Harbour. And of course, Sydney amateurs were associated with that entity. And they decided to use a very old historical flag of Australia, this white ensign, because it had been a proposed flag for New South Wales back in the 1850s and earlier. So there's no warrant, there's no official use of it, but there is no restriction stopping the use of this rather beautiful white ensign.
It is.
So it is now fantastic. A tradition of the Sydney Amateur Sailing Club that they wear that white ensign on special occasions. And it looks rather smart.
So it sounds like they've purloined this ensign.
Well, we'll keep this a secret, but I'm not going to stop them, and they're certainly not going to stop. But remember, their burgee is a dark blue St. George cross on a white triangular field. So the ensign and the burgee work in very well together. They're a pair.
Yes.
So it works very well.
Yeah, sure.
But on Australia Day, you'd put up the red ensign because you put up your national colours, and the white ensign you could probably put up halyard on the spreaders or something like that to show the tradition of the Sydney Amateur Sailing Club. So there we are. There's a solution to every etiquette question.
So, John, let's talk a little bit about protocol. As going back to those days as a young boy, my grandfather used to bang into my mind. Ensign used to go up at 8 o'clock in the morning, not a minute before, not a minute after. And then you proceeded forward, and finally the house flag went on right on the bow of the motorboat in those days. And there has been a question asked about should the ensign come down at sunset? Yes,
that's a very definite yes, because you're not going to fully illuminate. Now, the Australian national flag, when flown on the land, can be flown 24/7 if properly and effectively illuminated. Now, that was a tradition that started in Australia down at Capitol Hill in Canberra. Well, Capitol Hill now has the new Parliament House, and the Australian national flag, 40 feet by 20, flies there 24/7. And the only time it's taken down is to quickly replace it with a brand new one that is not tattered or faded. So they have two halyards, so you can actually raise a new one as you take the old one down. So,
is that right?
and the symbology of the, if that's an appropriate word, is that mast that has 4 supports. And one is over one house of the Parliament, the lower house, the other one's over the upper house. And
Yes.
it links Parliament together because those brackets come in to hold the big flag mast.
Yes.
And there is the chief national symbol of Australia by law, custom and tradition, the Australian national flag, our national flag of stars and crosses. And let's face it, it's very meaningful because your 3 crosses represent the principles on which Australia is based: parliamentary democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, and those other freedoms that we have in this country of ours. The Southern Cross gives us our position in the Southern Hemisphere, and the Commonwealth Star says that we're a federation of states and territories known as the Commonwealth or Commonweal of Australia. And Commonwealth means we pool our wealth amongst ourselves. So how appropriate is that?
Yes. And so the squadron flies its underfaced blue ensign under warrant, but it flies it 24/7 because it is fully floodlit.
Wonderful. That's excellent, because that mast is very tall, and there was an innovation when the peak of the gaff was rigged with a halyard. There's the uphaul goes to the block at the peak. That's the very top end of the gaff. Then it comes down the gaff to another block, well separated away from the flag.
Yes.
And on the halyard, above the blue ensign, you have a swivel clip known as Inglefield Clips, by Admiral Inglefield, who developed these snap-on clips. And at the bottom, you have another swivel clip, and that means that the flag can actually go round and round without tangling. Now, I have a fully rigged mast at my house here, and I have the same rig on the gaff. I have a yardarm from the First World War, and I have a flag mast that dates back 150 plus years, all painted up and looking perfect, of course, as I would expect. And I was greatly honoured in this year's Queen's Birthday Honours to get an honour of the OAM for vexillography and the preservation of history. So I think I'm the only one in the world that's ever got an honour for flags. So
someone asked me the question, how did you get involved to be so enthusiastic about this subject?
Goes back to my dear grandfather, Innes James George Vaughan, who had a flag mast in his backyard at his house in Ashley Street at Chatswood. And he flew the Australian national flag, and he had a barber shop, which was also a gift shop, and a tobacconist. And he actually sold flags, the Australian flag, as well as fishing gear and everything else. And my uncle was one of the barbers. So I got one of his flags, and I still have it, still very precious, got a few moth holes, because in those days, flags were made of wool bunting, pure wool bunting, and silverfish love them. So these days, they're woven polyester bunting that looks like wool, but it's about 15 times stronger. And you get a lot more wear out of your modern flag. And of course, I used to run Australiana flags, now run by Warren Cardwell. It's up at Northbridge, inappropriately Sailors Bay Road. And of course, up there, he makes all these flags. Australian made, he has Australian made logo on his flags. And of course, they're very good flags, the best quality, because they're Australian made as such. So there's a little plug for Warren. Go and see him. He knows all about etiquette and protocol and where to get everything that you want. And he'll do a bespoke flag for you. If you want your own name, or you want to taper the code flags in your initials, he can do that for you too. There's a perfect example of that, Wallara History and Heritage Society. It's run by an ex-naval captain, Peter Poland. And what they did was they took the initials of the organization and put it into the tapering code flags to make a broad tapered pennant. And it is a fabulous looking flag with a very strong maritime connection. Naturally, being in Vaucluse and that area, it is appropriate. And of course, we did many great ceremonies at South Head Signal Station. The arrival of Bligh at the time, the bicentenary of that, and all those sorts of things. We had Sir David Martin, the governor, out there and whatever. And it was just fabulous to do all these flag raisings. And in that book, I mentioned Australian flags issued by the Commonwealth Government. You get your free copy. You will see the big display on one occasion that I did with Peter Poland and his society out at South Head Signal Station. They actually published the photograph. So a real plus there. I've been involved too. I designed the Sydney Ferries house flag, which is actually a combination of the three original house flags of an independent sovereign Sydney Ferries. Then it was Sydney Harbour Ferries, and then Sydney Ferries as a government ownership. And that flag has been flying since it was adopted by Captain Costello, the harbour master of the day in the 1990s. And he adopted my flag on behalf of Sydney Ferries, and they've flown it ever since.
Wonderful. John, I think we're going to have to wrap this up. We've got, sort of gone a little over time, but it's been absolutely fascinating, and the time for me has just flown by. I think that maybe Zach has a special slide for us to finish up with, and you can actually make a few comments about this, John, because I know you're familiar with this. So this is our next presentation next month, which is being given by one of our members, David Salt, who was a former committee member of the cruising division. But perhaps you would like to comment about the origin of this ship.
Well, I hope you invite me to come in on Zoom on this one, because this is Endeavour 2. It was renamed from being called the Monte Cristo. She was beautifully built of the best quality timbers in Canada, sailed to Australia, and then did the reenactment for the bicentenary of Captain Cook's arrival in 1970. And it's a pity that she ran out of money, and Jeff Berry, who was the Canadian skipper and captain of the vessel, had a warrant nailed to the mast. Anyway, she sailed off to New Zealand. I'm not sure whether they paid their bills or not, and did a bit of a tour of New Zealand, was very popular. And the story went that she went out to do a rescue, and the weather was pretty foul, and it got much worse. And she couldn't sail because of the terrible conditions, and she ran out of fuel and was washed up and became a total wreck on one of New Zealand's famous beaches. So it'll be a very interesting talk. David Salt, I'm sure, will present one of the most outstanding talks of the year. So everyone participate.
So just to add to that, David Salt was actually on board when the boat was wrecked, and he put together a PowerPoint of his slides from all those years ago, because that was back in 71, is it? 72? Something
Yeah,
like
it
that?
would have been about that.
Yeah,
yes.
that's right, yeah. So we're looking forward to that in a month's time. And John, certainly we'd love to have you along as a guest. We'll get an invite to you. And I would just like to say, on behalf of the Cruising Division, thank you for a most entertaining and interesting talk. Time has just flown by, and all I can say is, once again, thank you. I'm sorry we haven't got a bottle of wine to give you as a vote of thanks.
Hoist a flag. Hoist the racing flag when you go racing next time. But look, thank you, Richard. Thank you, John. And a special thank you to Max Press OAM, who, lobbied to have me as a guest speaker again. And to all the good members, and I'm sure you're all good at the squadron, congratulations on your new racing pennant, and fly your flags with the due etiquette and protocol, and you'll continue to be the best squadron, the best club in the whole of Australia.
Thank you, John. That's very
Thank
kind.
you, John.
Thank you.
Very, very appreciative. It was a great presentation. Flagtastic.
Absolutely.
I'll copyright that.
No, that was one of our members has already sent in their congratulations, saying using that term.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, you make this vexillographer very happy.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, everyone, then. And then Richard, JT, and John, that was a great presentation. I will make sure to send you all the statistics tomorrow, and this will be